to Out of the Ether with Brandon Hardy. For this project, we may start with a bit of an art history lesson. Among my favorite artists is the American painter Ivan Albright. Based in Chicago, he was known for his dark and incredibly elaborate paintings. His works of magical realism are, to my mind, deeply underappreciated. For the 1945 film adaptation of The Picture of Dorian Gray, Albright was selected to create the final iteration of the portrait. Perhaps my favorite work of his is this painting, titled That Which I Should Have Done I Did Not Do, otherwise titled The Door. A towering work in scale and detail, the painting is over 8 feet high and took 10 years to paint. In this episode, I'll be creating his door. The piece will not be an exact replica. I don't have 10 years to spend on this, but perhaps we can capture some of its spirit.
For this project, I started by buying this beat-up old door off of Facebook Marketplace for 20 bucks. Hanging and fitting a door can be kind of tricky, especially in an existing frame, so I decided to take a different approach here. I was able to find a door that was basically a perfect match for the door I have hanging in my space. I had the idea that if I peeled off the facing of this door, I could apply it to my actual door and it would nest perfectly into it. That gave me the freedom to go as far as I wanted into recreating the really intense architecture and textures of the Ivan Albright door while still preserving the door underneath it. As you can see, I started by using my jigsaw to split open the door from the side and separate the two facings. I started by drilling a pilot hole that was big enough for the jigsaw blade to fit into. This was mostly easy because the door is pretty hollow, but there were a couple parts that were reinforced by thicker wood. Getting through those just took a little patience, but once it was done, I used this new oscillating multi-tool to pry up the pieces of wood that remained on the back. Before I did this, I made sure I was using the facing from the side of the door that matches the side of the door that I'm going to be decorating. Removing all this mass from the back ensures that when I apply this to my actual door, I'm going to get a nice flat fit. The facing of molded doors like this is usually made out of pressed MDF board, which is pretty thin. It's only a couple millimeters, so I was very careful with this tool not to cut through anywhere I didn't want to. Then I used a sensible karate chop to remove some of the cardboard filler, and for the pieces of wood that lined the top and the bottom of the door, I just knocked them off gently with a hammer. It was at this stage that I realized I probably could have done this to the wood all the way around the door instead of going back and having to shave off the remains like this, but I would have had to destroy the other facing of the door to do that, so maybe it's better. I then sanded the door in all the spots that I removed things just to make sure it was really flat. My new multi-tool was really handy for this, so thank you to all of you watching. I've never owned one of these tools myself before, and it was an investment born of your patronage. Once this facing was totally flat and clean on the backside, it was time to flip it over and start priming. For this base coat, I'm just using simple black acrylic paint, and I'm being kind of messy with the paint job. I didn't want it to be particularly flat or perfect or shiny, so I really jabbed the paintbrush down into it. You can see it creates a little bit more texture, and this door is all about texture, so I figured let's just have it at every stage of the process. It's also just kind of therapeutic to paint with this jabbing motion. Being able to paint this door lying flat like this is one of the great benefits of my chosen approach for this project. While that was drying, I started working on some of the architectural elements for this door. I picked up these ornamental corner blocks from a local hardware store. The only thing is they're a little thicker than I want them to be, so I decided to make a really simple mold. I hot glued the corner block down to a piece of foam core and then sprayed that with mold release. I kind of improvised this mold because it was the middle of the night and I kind of just wanted to get it done without buying new supplies, so I used my hot glue gun and just covered the entire corner block in hot glue. Is this the most professional way of making a mold? Absolutely not, but for something quick and dirty and simple like this, where I only needed to mold 2 of them, it totally worked. I hit the whole thing with my heat gun to make sure that the glue melted evenly over the surface, and then after it had dried, I just pried it off. Now, before you get too excited, know that this only worked because this piece I was molding didn't have any undercuts. That's why the mold slides off easy. I then used Durham's rock putty to make the positives from the mold. I got this from the same local hardware store, and this stuff is really easy to use. You just pour the dry powder into a dish and then just add water until it reaches your desired consistency. There's no measurement, there's no chemical reaction, it's just mix it up, pour it in, and let it dry. The lack of chemical reaction is why I can use this in a mold made out of hot glue, because if I used a resin or something like that, that might heat up and then it would just melt the mold from underneath it. I'm hitting the mold on the table to get rid of any air bubbles, but also to level the mixture so the piece has a flat back. In doing this, I saw that I actually hadn't made enough of the mixture to fill the mold to the level that I needed, so I literally just went and mixed up some more and poured it in. Really, this stuff is so simple. You can see from the level of the mixture that these pieces will be about ½ an inch thinner than the piece that I started with. I let that dry overnight, and then when I came back, as advertised, it was hard as a rock. One thing I realized though was that I had forgotten to spray the mold with mold release before I poured in the rock putty. I was lucky and this piece came out without a lot of fuss, but make sure that you spray your mold with mold release before you pour things into it. I did that with the second one and it came out much more easily. Then I took an X-Acto knife and I scratched up the back of both of these pieces. I traced out where they were set to go on the door, and then I scratched up that part of the door with an X-Acto knife. Then I mixed up some simple 5-minute epoxy and used that to glue them in place. This epoxy is really easy to work with too. You just squeeze out 2 equal-sized blobs and mix them together. The reason I did all that scratching with the X-Acto knife was to give the epoxy something to sort of sink its teeth into to better hold the pieces together. Epoxy tends to be pretty good and strong no matter how you use it, but I wanted to make sure that these pieces never had a chance of falling off. I applied the epoxy both to the door and to the back side of the piece, but that might have been excessive, but I just wanted to make sure it was really secure. Then before the epoxy set, I made sure to position them exactly where I wanted them because moving them again later was not going to be an option. It's called 5-minute epoxy, but I tend to let it cure overnight before I move on to the next steps, so the next day I came back and spray painted these black. Then it was time to do some sculpting. I used epoxy sculpt, which is one of my favorite sculpting materials. It comes in 2 parts, A and B, and you just mix them together. My part B was looking a little crusty and old here, but I just mixed it up a little bit first and it worked out fine. Like the last few things we used, epoxy sculpt is really nice because you don't have to measure scientifically. You can just roll a ball of part A and then roll a similar sized ball of part B and mix them together and it's gonna work. Part A and part B are different colors, so you can tell when it's mixed thoroughly because it'll all be one color. I applied the epoxy sculpt directly to the door facing and just started sculpting it with a little sculpting tool. The door in the painting has all these architectural grooves and notches carved into it, but because this door facing needs to sit on my door like a perfectly formed mask, I'm actually just building out parts of the door to create the impression that it's been carved into rather than actually carving into it. The way epoxy sculpt hardens is that it basically has a countdown clock built into it. The minute it's thoroughly mixed, the chemical reaction begins, but it happens slowly over the course of a couple hours. So you've got time to work with it, but I suggest going in small sections rather than trying to do a whole bunch at once. Otherwise, you might have parts of it cure before you got around to sculpting it. Once that was all cured and painted black, I went in with some modeling paste. I used a big chip brush and applied it roughly and generously over most of the face of the door. This is why I was only mostly concerned with getting the general shape of the architecture from the epoxy sculpt, because I knew I was going to go in with this modeling paste and apply a rough texture on top of everything. The goal here was to be as uneven as possible. The door in the painting looks like it has been through hell, so the chip brush gives me a nice heavy wood grain sort of texture, but then I also went in and blotted parts of it with this quilted paper towel. The quilting left an impression in the modeling paste that looked really detailed and unusual. For an additional texture, I applied crackle medium to the face of the door. I just squeezed it out generously over the facing and brushed it unevenly, and then while it was still wet, I took gray acrylic paint and brushed that over the crackle medium. To get the best result from the crackles, you want to apply this in one broad stroke. You don't want to go back and brush over the same spot multiple times. If you do that, the acrylic paint and the crackle medium will just start to blend together instead of splitting apart. The cracks naturally start to form pretty quickly, but you can use a heat gun to help speed up the process and even develop bigger cracks. This step in particular would have been a huge mess if I tried to paint it on a vertical door. By the way, just to be clear about the order of operations here, after the modeling paste dried, I spray painted the whole door black, and then only after that was dried did I start applying the crackle medium. I did this whole crackle process over the entire surface of the door. I made a careful point to stay too long in some spaces with my heat gun to create massive bubbles, and I used a stick to sort of pick them apart and help them melt into really gnarly texture. You have to be smart and careful when working with a heat gun. One, because of the potential that you could set something on fire, but also because in a case like this, heating something like paint can give off fumes, so you gotta make sure that you're working in a well-ventilated area and using proper respiratory protection. You can see here in this close-up shot how the heat gun helps the paint to sort of migrate across the crackle medium. This helps make the crackle patterns even more widespread and unpredictable. I found this pressed molding at a hardware store nearby that I thought would be perfect for this door. The door itself, of course, needs to be fascinating, but I think the framing around it has the potential to take this project to the next level. I found these corbels on Amazon that don't specifically resemble anything in the painting, but I had an idea for the space above the door and I thought these spoke to that. After everything was primed with black spray paint, I repeated the same crackle medium process from the door face. For some reason, I decided to prop the molding up at an angle while doing this and see if having the paint run down it naturally with the flow of gravity somehow changed anything, and I don't know that it really made any sort of meaningful difference in the end, but it was just another way of getting the job done. However, what you're not seeing here is that with both the molding and the door face itself, I did try to do this vertically, and that was a bad idea. Don't do that. Once again, I pulled out my handy dandy heat gun and got to work. Same as before, I used it to make bubbles and let the whole thing start to develop a really decayed looking texture. There was something really nice here about the way the bubbles seemed to like to develop inside the grooves of the pressed molding. Before that was totally dry, I went in and patted it down with some of that quilted paper towel. There's something in that quilting texture that I'm just really enjoying for this project. After that, I went in with Design Master Walnut Wood Tone Spray and a glossy clear coat. What I did here was I first sprayed the molding with the walnut wood tone and then immediately after went in with a clear coat and sort of pressure washed it away. I did this strategically and only in certain places, so there would still be the brown spray on it, but it would just be broken up. You can see the combination of these two sprays lets the wood tone drip down in a really beautiful way. I then took some gloss black spray paint and repeated the same process. You can see from the way it's turning out that this is a great way to get a unique distressed look out of your paint. It feels like there are layers of grime that have just been developing and being eaten away at over the course of years. Then I went in again with that paper towel, but this time I put a little bit of gray paint on it to get that quilt to really pop. After that, I repeated the crackle process on my corbels, but I made a point of doing this over a spare piece of cardboard because this thing is dimensional, which means that the paint and the crackle medium are just kind of bound to run off on some of the sides. So in a project full of messy steps, this one is just bound to be messier than some of the others. And then once again, I repeated the steps with the heat gun, the walnut wood tone, the clear coat, the black spray paint, and the paper towel. I have to say, this quote-unquote pressure washing technique that I'm using here is something that I've really come to enjoy, and I find myself using it on a lot of projects, especially when I need to distress things. In Ivan Albright's painting, we never see the space over the door, so I decided to get creative and build an elaborate transom. To start, I took a piece of foam core and drew out a design for an intricate corbel. I used an X-Acto knife to cut out the design, which would become the template. So you can see the foam core is buckling a little bit here. I'm using a really cheap foam core that actually comes from Dollar Tree. I've come to really like that recently. I think it's more than just the cost. There's something about the quality of the material that's a little bit different than like the good stuff. Pick up a piece and see what I mean. For $1.25, it's worth it. Then I traced out the template on a sheet of pink insulation foam and used my jigsaw to cut it out. This is not necessarily the cleanest way to cut something like this, but this is also not necessarily the project where I want things to be the cleanest. You saw that painting. Rough around the edges is fine. I took my time and went slow with this because a jigsaw is more intense than is necessary to cut through this kind of foam. The main reason I chose to use my jigsaw instead of a different tool is that the flat bottom of the jigsaw ensures that your blade will always cut in a perfectly perpendicular fashion through your project. Another benefit to using the jigsaw is that since this is soft foam I'm cutting, I don't have to pre-drill any of the interior cuts that I need to make. I can just press the jigsaw down through it and start cutting. But just to be clear, that's only something I can get away with because this is foam. If I were to go to do something like this with wood, I would have to pre-drill it to give the blade somewhere to be inserted into so I could start the interior cut. Overall, you can see the result is not bad. I carved out 3 of these for each side of the transom. Then I cut out this long, thin piece of foam to line the top of the doorway and to support the corbels. If you look close, you can see I actually cut off a piece of one of the corbels by mistake, but I just glued it back on later. To secure the pieces in place, I just got some 3-inch screws and drove right through the foam. I made sure to screw these in a couple different places at a couple different angles to minimize the likelihood that they'd shift position. The piece was off to a good start, but I wanted to add some more details, so I used my oscillating tool to carve away some of the foam and create a more distinct ledge. Like the jigsaw, this tool is more robust than is necessary for this particular task. But it did work, so as long as you're careful, this does work for something like this. And you know, you get that extra hit of joy that comes from playing with your new toy. Then I broke away all those pieces of foam that I just cut, and then I used a sanding block to help shape it a little bit further. Like I said before, I don't mind this project being really rough around the edges. In fact, I think it's fitting for the painting this project is inspired by, so I'm using the sanding block less to finish things out and make them nice and smooth, and more to clarify the rough texture in a way that is just like what I want it to be. This gave the overall piece a sort of hand-hewn look that I really like. I'm a sculptor. I like when things look sculptural, so I kept working at it and just kind of knocked down the edges and took some chunks out of it with the sanding block until I felt like it was beat up and old looking. After that, I gave all of the foam a really, really light pass with the heat gun. And I mean really light. If you look close, you can see I am barely melting it. And what this does is it just kind of closes up the foam a little bit and makes it easier to paint. Here's me with a scrap of foam showing you what not to do, which is heating it up way too much and actually deforming the shape of the foam. Don't do that to your piece or I will cry. Instead, the right thing to do is just use the lightest touch possible, and when it barely starts to glisten, move away. Then I use some water-based black spray paint by Liquitex. It says right on the front that that it's water-based, and that is important. Most regular spray paint is solvent-based, and if you spray it on foam like this, it'll just dissolve. But we don't want that. We put in too much work, so we're just gonna use water-based. I could have just base coated this with acrylic paint by hand, but because there are so many weird shapes and nooks and crannies in these corbels, I just thought it would be better to spray it with a water-based spray and make sure that I really get into all those crevices. Then after that, I took my gray acrylic craft paint and started brushing that onto the highest ridges of the foam. I'm purposefully painting this in a very irregular fashion. As you've probably sensed by now, everything about this project is meant to be at least somewhat irregular. You can't really tell yet, but the gray is actually going to be like the medium tone here. While all that paint was still wet, I went in and just kind of tried to mess it up a little bit more. However, some of that paint had already dried, so I went in with some dry brushing just to mess it up even further. And in case you don't know what dry brushing is, I'm going to show you now. It's basically when you dip your brush in paint, but then brush most of the paint back out of the brush before you use it. What that does is create a very distinct and bristly texture for your paint. It's a great way to make things look old. You're essentially creating a scratchy surface all over with paint. It's called dry brushing, of course, because the brush is mostly dry, as opposed to wet painting where the brush has a lot of paint on it, and most people just think of that as painting. See how the paint is like barely scratching the surface here? Dry brushing. Then I came back in with some modeling paste because I am all about modeling paste for this project. See how it creates stiff peaks? That's exactly what I want for this. I'm applying the modeling paste in as irregular a fashion as I can, and then I'm going back in with a bigger brush and just kind of pulling the texture forward. It has a little bit of like a toothpaste consistency to it, so think about applying toothpaste in a way that like creates little stalactites all over your thing. Not a great way to brush your teeth, but a cool way to make a project. Then it was time for the transom window. I used this piece of plexiglass my neighbor left on the curb, and then I grabbed some thin weather seal stripping from the hardware store. I'm making a fake leaded glass window for this transom. I started by drawing out the pattern on this piece of foam core, and then I'm using the weather stripping to trace it all out on top of the plexiglass. The weather stripping is self-adhesive, so this is kind of easy. The hardest part was just shaping the curves the way I wanted. The foam is going to be the base for the fake leading, which makes it look like these are actually different pieces of glass stuck together instead of just one big piece. For the next step, I used my black hot glue gun and used it to pool glue all along the top of the foam. This created a raised, shiny, rounded surface that really captures the texture of window leading. This takes a little time and care, so go slow and be patient, but ultimately the result is worth it. If you make any mistakes here like I did, you can just go in with an X-Acto knife and peel up the bits of glue that drip over the edge in places you don't want. Also, I realized after I forgot to put these horizontal lines, you should definitely try to get your whole pattern down in foam before going at it with the glue. I gave the whole thing a quick pass with my heat gun, which melted any imperfections in the hot glue and also kind of warped the plexi, which was really nice. It gave it some of the irregularity that old stained glass is known for. Then I took this antique silver paint. I know it says gold in big letters, but that's the brand. That's not the paint color. Then I just used my finger to apply that silver paint on top of all the hot glue. This really makes it look like leading. Then I needed to frame it out, so I found this weird ornate molding and just kind of went for it. I cut all the pieces with my jigsaw rather than anything fancier than that, so the corners are a little imperfect, but I'm into it. I actually used the piece of foam core I traced everything on to be the base of this, so I cut it to fit around the window design and just hot glued the pieces of molding in place. For the next step, I used super gloss Mod Podge and a can of compressed air. First, I applied the Mod Podge to all the exposed plexiglass. Then using the compressed air, or a straw if the can dies, blow around the surface of the Mod Podge to create ripples. I did this all over, trying to be really careful not to get any of the Mod Podge on top of the fake leading. Thankfully, the weather stripping is thick enough to create a nice little well for it. Then I got these stained glass effect paints from Michaels. After the Mod Podge had dried, I filled in some of the spaces to make them look like colored glass. If you go to use something like this, I would encourage you to do a test beforehand just so you can see what the color actually looks like when it cures, because they look very different than they do straight out of the bottle. Then I went back and I aged and textured the frame for this transom just the way that I did for all the molding earlier. In my travels, I came across this wreath at a thrift store that I thought would be perfect to convert into the wreath from this painting. The bones of it, so to speak, are already right, and the fact that there was even a pink bow positioned in the same spot on the left kind of just felt like the universe was telling me something. I started by picking out all the fake flowers and little branches that were in the wreath to have a blank slate to work from. The flowers are fake, but the eucalyptus is real, so thankfully the scent wasn't too strong. Eucalyptus just isn't my favorite. Then I bought some fake plants from Michaels to help spruce things up. I had all the leaves with my heat gun to melt the plastic and make them look withered and dying. I did the same thing with these fake roses, also from Michaels. Because I tend to distress my fake plants and make them look dead and old and gross, I tend not to be too particular about where I get them from. Somebody asked me recently if I get my flowers from a special vendor or something like that, but because I'm doctoring them and doing all this stuff to make them look different anyway, it doesn't seem to be necessary. Because I had them, I ended up reusing some of the roses that came with this wreath and just treated them like all the others. I also used these rubbery calla lilies from Facebook Marketplace. After the heat gun step was completed, completed on all the plants, I split these apart so I could attach them to the wreath individually. I'll be honest, I'm not even sure why I filmed this step, I'm just cutting them with scissors. It's pretty intuitive. Then I hot glued these black leaves into the lower half of the wreath, keeping an eye on my reference photo for the painting, not to make it exactly the same, but just to make sure I'm placing things roughly where they were. I did try treating these calla lilies with the heat gun, but they just kind of melted the rubber. It was a little weird. I let myself play with the arrangement a little bit before I hot glued everything down just to make sure I liked how it was gonna look. I liked these little branches that came with the wreath originally, so I put them back in too. Black hot glue is great for stuff like this because it just disappears in the shadows. Then I got some sheer pink ribbon. I think this was also from Michael's, I don't really remember. I made a point to cut the ends in a really kind of aggressive way just because I wanted the ends to be totally frayed. This ribbon is made from polyester, and polyester shrinks beautifully under a heat gun. It just shrinks and warps and distorts itself into beautiful shapes, and it's super organic and totally simple to do. After that, I wanted to tatter the ribbon a bit, so I actually just took a screw and ran it along the length of it. The screw just pulled at the threads and did exactly what I needed. Then it was time once again to use my spray paint pressure washing trick. However, I wanted the flowers to look recently dead rather than like completely dead, so I did the clear coat first as a base layer and got everything wet. Then I went in with the walnut wood tone, and then after that I went back in with the clear coat and pressure washed that away. Starting with a base layer of the clear coat acted as sort of a resist and made it so that the flowers didn't just completely absorb the walnut wood tone. Part of what's so nice about this process is that it's so easy and so fast, so you can get really intricate, nuanced aging in all of these flowers, and all it takes is just going back and forth with 2 different cans of spray. If you feel like the flower looks too light, go back in with the dark spray, and if you feel like the flower's getting too dark, you just go back in with the clear coat. It doesn't dry instantly, so you've got time to work with it, but it's spray paint, so it still dries pretty fast, so when you're done, you don't have to wait forever. I noticed at the last second the black leaves in the painting kind of looked shiny, so I just hit them with a gloss clear coat. One of the most impressively detailed elements of this painting is the doorknob. I started with the base of a real doorknob, which I hot glued to some plexiglass. There are little ridges in the back of the doorknob that help it stay in place in a door, so I dremeled out holes in the plexiglass for that and carved little corresponding holes in a sheet of foam core to use as a base. That way it won't slide around or scratch my table. Once again, I'm breaking out the epoxy sculpt. Just like before, I made a ball of part A and a same size ball of part B and then mixed them together. Before it's totally done being mixed, you can still see stripes of the different colors in there, but then when it's totally done like this, it's all one solid color. I started by filling in the outline that I drew on the plexiglass. Epoxy sculpt can be smoothed out with water, so I always keep a little container nearby when I'm working with it. By the way, I promise that was an old water bottle I refilled. I'm not using Poland Spring to blend clay. You can use the water with your fingers or with tools. And speaking of tools, the ferrule of a pencil eraser, the little metal part that holds it on, is perfect for shaping and making a little stamp press. It wasn't totally necessary for this project, but I wanted to show you all the tips. In fact, this project is the perfect excuse not to use a stamp because the geometry in the Ivan Albright painting is so wonky that it actually looks more like the painting to have it be imperfect. So even when smoothing things out, I didn't let it be completely smooth. Make sure to regularly clean your tools while you're working with epoxy sculpt, or it might come to stick permanently. And by the way, just so it's known, you can use epoxy sculpt with your bare hands. I just don't necessarily like how it makes my hands feel afterwards. So for this project, I wore gloves. Because it slowly starts to cure as you're working with it, that first hour that you have the epoxy sculpt mixed is the best time to mass in the larger parts of your project, and then in the second hour you can start putting in more detail. I know I said stamps weren't necessary for this project, but I did use a few to make some perfectly round bits to look like the screws in the door plate. Notice how those stamps were a Sharpie and a pen? Not all of your tools have to be tools. When all of that was cured, I peeled back the plexiglass to remove the doorknob from it. That way the piece had a perfectly flat back, but it was easily removable. Also, don't get clay in the mechanism. I let the doorknob cure, but I wasn't totally done detailing it. I had this tiny little Dremel bit with which I went back in and carved away more detail. This takes a lot of patience and a steady hand. Whenever I'm working on something tiny and intricate like this, I tend to think of myself like a jeweler. Something about holding that vision in my mind, I feel like steadies my hand and makes it easier to make tiny little motions. I also went back in with a bigger drill bit to grind down some of the parts that felt a little too messy. To attach this little bit, I just scratched up the back with an X-Acto and then used the epoxy sculpt as a glue. Then it was time for the doorknob itself. I mixed up some epoxy sculpt and then realized I did something very wrong. I forgot to mark out the bottom of the doorknob as it sits on the axis of the mechanism. If I hadn't done that, it would have been totally possible for the design to end up lopsided once it's installed on the door. Once again, I used a couple clever stamps here, bottle caps, pen tips. Use what you got, people. Thankfully, I think I was mostly in the right frame of mind when I was sculpting this doorknob, because it didn't really occur to me that if I had messed up on the actual doorknob part, I would have to throw out the whole doorknob and start over, even though I already finished the door plate. Glad that didn't happen. In another moment of stamp foolery, I used the grip on the side of this sculpting tool and pressed it into the rounded edge of the doorknob just to create a little more texture. And then again, I went in with that teeny tiny Dremel bit, mostly just reinforcing the depth of the things that I'd already sculpted. This is by far one of the most painstaking parts of the project, but it's also one of the parts I think you'll notice the most, so I really want to deliver. Once I was happy with the sculpture, I sanded everything down with some 600 grit sandpaper. That gets things really smooth. This is going to be something that people will touch, so I want it to feel really nice. I brushed away all the dust before I started painting. I'm once again using Montana Black brand gold spray paint to make something really shiny. But in this case, it can't get too shiny because doorknobs get worn down. So I'm aging it with some modeling paste and acrylic paint. I watered down the paint just a bit, brushed it on generously, and then went back in with a paper towel and wiped most of it off. That way the paint creates the impression of a patina that's collected in the recesses, but you still get some of that shiny goodness coming through. I went over the whole thing with multiple layers until I was happy with how it was looking. One of the best tips I can offer for doing something like this is to do whatever you can to disguise the fact that a paintbrush was ever involved. The kind of marks and patterns that paintbrushes are likely to make typically are way less organic than the way that something naturally tarnishes. That's why using water and rubbing things away with paper towels really helps here. It tends to mask out the shapes that a paintbrush wants to naturally make, which do not actually look all that natural. I went in with some brown paint too, just to darken some parts of it, and though I don't think I have video footage of it, I also did a quick wash with some black. At one point, I think I went a little too far, so I actually just sprayed some of the gold straight out of the can and then applied that directly to a couple spots, just to bring back a few little highlights here and there. I want this thing to look really old and deteriorated, but it's nice to see a little glint of light here and there. Once again, let's demonstrate the importance of hiding the impression of your brush strokes. See how fake that looks? If you just blot it a little bit, all of a sudden, it looks so much more real. Same thing here on the head of the doorknob. See how fake that looks? Suddenly, when you pat it and rub it away a little bit, it starts to be more believable. Before I install this project in place, I have to prep the real door. You maybe wouldn't tell from the kind of projects I do, but I'm not planning on staying here forever, so I want everything about this to be temporary and undoable. Rather than paint the existing door molding black, I'm just using black gaffer's tape. This stuff gets expensive, but the reason for that is because it peels back up like a dream. I bet I could leave this on here for years, and when I pull it back up, there won't be any residue. This tape is standard behind the scenes in all forms of professional entertainment. To attach the facing that I made to this door, I used some shims from the bottom and then just tacked it on with some screws in the corners. Despite all the work that I did to it, this facing is still really lightweight, so it shouldn't be going anywhere. I then installed the transom and made sure that when I did that, I screwed directly into the beams inside the wall and the ceiling. I don't want to risk any part of this falling. From there, it was just a matter of dressing things out with the other pieces that I'd made. Installing this doorknob really was one of the most exciting parts because it just brought everything completely together. However, I still wanted to give everything one last pass. Ivan Albright's painting is tremendously detailed, so I went in with a tiny brush and some black acrylic paint and really emphasized all the different shadows around the door and tried to capture as much detail from the painting as I could. You may not know this about me, but I actually went to college to study painting, and that college is part of the Art Institute of Chicago, which is the museum that owns the original door painting. I studied that painting intensely while I was in school there, but now that I've done this, I can really see why the original took 10 years. I went back in with some modeling paste to bring out some of the highlights. The modeling paste has a very matte texture to it, which is an interesting contrast to the black paint, which has a lot of sheen. Because of that, the way the light plays with this door is really fascinating and adds a lot of life to what otherwise might feel like a very physically flat project.